I've taken a couple of pieces of scrap watercolor paper for this demonstration, and I prepared them before I started the camera. I put a little bit of this tape, painter's tape here. I put some Frisket here and a little bit of the masking fluid here. I've also dampened the lower part of this. I wanted to show you what I was talking about when I was speaking the wet in wet and wet in damp. I've made a very thin, slightly blue water here for this demonstration. Now, what I'm going to do is this is damp paper, and I'm going to put some more color on it. As you can see, it's pretty wet. My brush was very wet. Now I'm going to just blot off my brush a little bit and watch what happens to that paint I just put on there. It picks it up. You don't want that to happen right now. That's that's a form of lifting, but typically we don't lift on wet paper, because once you lift out the color, the rest of it just sort of flows in there. So there's one other thing I want to speak to you about. It's how you touch the paper. When you have a very full brush, all you have to do is barely touch it, and the paint's going to go on there. That's a lot of water in that brush, this little brush here. I take some of that out, and I have to press harder to get the color to come out. So you have to consider when you're making a stroke across your paper, how wet your paper is, how much water is in your brush, and how hard you're going to have to press to get the stroke that you want out of that. But another unique thing about watercolors that's entirely different from most of the other media. I don't have to drag the paint out of there. I can touch the paper, and as you can see, it'll start flowing out into the surrounding area. I do that with a pencil or anything else, and it just stays there. Now, wet and wet, or wet into damp, what occurs with that, this makes it different from wet on dry, is you don't have any hard lines. Now, you may have a hard line here and around these edges here, but if I just paint around something, the line's not going to be hard. I do that wet on dry, I paint around something, I'm going to have a hard edge there. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and wet down this paper, and it might buckle, but that's part of the demonstration, and I'm going to show you what happens now. Okay, I've wet this down with clear water from this point down about this point, but I need to tell you, I also raised it up to about a 20 to 30 degree angle so the paint and the water will flow down. You have to determine the angle that you're most comfortable with. That's the reason why I use this old French easel without the legs on it. I set it here on my table, because I can move it up and down. And I also turn my painting over, and I do a lot of things with it, move it around. And this makes it convenient. Before it was horizontal, and now I've raised it to a slight angle. So the advantage of painting wet and wet is that you don't get a lot of lines when after your stroke, and you get another stroke and another stroke. The line sort of merges in there, and you'll see that when we paint wet on dry. Now the other thing about doing washes, they have a concept. It's called atmospheric perspective or aerial perspective, and what that means is when you paint a sky and you actually look at the sky, it's darker at the top and lighter at the bottom, and the way you can achieve that later on, when we get into more detail about washes, is that you just put more paint at the top, and you can wet it down again. You can always go back and wet it down if you got to stretch. Notice from what I was telling you in previous discussions, how this is buckling and everything, and this is starting to buckle too. So I'm going to go ahead and start this wash, and this is peacock blue, and it's the staining. So I'll go ahead and start. And the other thing you have to have, which is important, is a paper towel. Okay, here we go. One stroke right across the top. Notice how it's not to worry. Another stroke. Another stroke. You notice it moving? Another stroke. And I messed up right there. But I'm going to go ahead, since I'm painting wet on wet, I can get away with a lot. Now, there's a couple of things I can do at this point. But most important, I have to get this thing horizontal again and get it back flat so that paint flattens out. Because I'm trying to get a flat wash. And I can pick it up and I can move it around and let the paint flow a little bit. And I can do it this way also. You notice how the paint's piling up here? It might run underneath there. It's not to worry. We can work with that later. But the reason why this is not completely flat is because the paper's buckling, which I spoke to you. It's not stretched. I just got it tacked down there so it doesn't fall off the board. Okay, I'm going to let this dry and then we'll come back. While this wet on wet is drying, I'm going to go ahead and do the wet on dry. Now, this is where the angle of your easel is a little more important than it is on wet, because when you put wet on wet, it just goes in there and it starts spreading around. Now, the whole idea here, if I can do it, you need a lot of practice for this. This is the ultramarine light. Is I'm going to do one stroke, and there should be a small bead of paint at the bottom of that stroke. And on my next stroke, I'm going to try and pick that up, and then the one after that, one after that. Okay, here we go. I should be able to get this on before the paper knows that it's wet, and so the wash will probably come out a little bit better. Catching that bottom line, there's not a lot of paint here. I probably should put a little more paint in my brush, but it's going on nicely anyway. I missed that there. This is really a no-no. Okay. You can see the imperfections in there. Okay, one more time, and then we're going to call it a wrap for this demo. And you can see the line there. That this up here worked well. If it works right, this paint will start flowing down a little bit. I'm going to leave it like that. And since this is cheap paint or paper, you can see a little imperfection there. And you can see how it worked around, and the paint again's piling up here. And we'll see what that looks like when we take all this stuff off. Okay, they're dry. I've taken off the tape and the masking fluid and the frisket. Here's the lessons we need to take away from this thing. One, don't use cheap paper. This is real cheap machine-made paper I used in the past to practice my washes on. Earlier I told you about using a lot of water and how your paper's going to buckle. Well, here's a good example of it. We used a lot of water, it's all wrinkly and buckly. This one, we went in with the dry. It's not too bad. It came out okay. All right, this, notice the sharp lines with the painter's tape. Worked well. Paint creeped underneath the frisket. I should have burnished it down some more. The masking fluid worked well. Remember now, this is opera blue, staining. This is easy lift. And we're going to go back in later, and I'm going to show you how to lift and scrub out some of these problems like this underwriting here and this here. Okay, that I think just about concludes the washes. You should be able to get started and happy painting. We'll talk in detail about the more of the finer details of washes and stuff, like how you do an aerial perspective and various things like that.